Well, welcome to all who have joined us tonight. This is the third evening in a week-long symposium, The Great Awakening Meets a Just Awakening, the 250th commemorative anniversary of George Whitefield. My name is Sara Singleton. I'm the pastor at Old South Presbyterian Church in Newburyport, Massachusetts, where Whitefield is buried. And tonight, we are honored to have Dr. Eric Washington, Assistant Professor and History Director of the African and African Diaspora Studies at Calvin College in Grand Rapids. And Eric was saying it was getting a little cool there, and fall is settling in. Dr. Washington, in his writings as a scholar, is easily identified as being thoroughly reformed in his thinking. So I would call you a theologian as well. His focus is on the African American church from the time of Whitefield through the 19th century. I know that the presidential debate is in 2 hours, and we respect your interest in other things, but tonight you are in a great story of a racial debate that has been going on for centuries. And Dr. Washington will present for 45 minutes, allowing us about 30 minutes of question and answer. And I invite you to use the chat line at the bottom of your frame so that you can write questions, and we will present those following the talk that you are presenting tonight. We welcome you, Dr. Eric Washington.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, I am presenting tonight from, I guess the title is Whitefield as Footnote, really the first age of emancipation in the United States. So dealing with the issue of slavery and race, as well as revivals. So in his 1789 interesting narrative, African-born, Igbo-speaking, formerly enslaved person and evangelical Christian, Lyle de Equiano, recalled seeing a famous evangelist in Philadelphia in 1776 one Sunday. And he described what he saw in the following manner. He wrote, "I came to a church crowded with people. The churchyard was full likewise, and a number of people were even mounted on ladders, looking in at the windows. I thought this a strange sight, as I had never seen churches either in England or in the West Indies crowded in this manner before. I therefore made bold to ask some people the meaning of all this, and they told me the Reverend Mr. George Whitefield was preaching. I had often heard of this gentleman and had wished to see and hear him, but I had never had an opportunity. I now therefore resolved to gratify myself with the sight, and I pressed in amidst the multitude. When I got into the church, I saw this pious man exhorting the people with the greatest fervor and earnestness, and sweating as much as I ever did while in slavery on Montserrat Beach. I was very much struck and impressed with this. I thought it strange. I had never seen divines exert themselves in this manner before, and I was no longer at a loss to account for the thin congregations they preached to." This passage in Equiano's important, interesting narrative offers a first-hand glimpse into the type of preaching that typified this era. The year 1766 marked the tail end of the Great Awakening, but judging from Equiano's description, people were still interested in hearing the word of the Lord from stellar preachers like Whitefield. Equiano, in cheeky manner, even reasons why Anglican churches back in England had small congregations. Basically, the vicars were boring. There's one problem here in this passage. Equiano actually did not see Whitefield at this particular moment in time. His biographers, Vincent Coretta, and also one editor of his work, Robert Allison, who's the historian, they note this, and Allison notes this in particular. Equiano and Whitefield were never in Philadelphia at the same time, but both were in Savannah in February 1765. So that is the footnote in Allison's edited version of Equiano's narrative. And that's basically how I got the idea to title this talk, Whitefield as Footnote. According to Allison and literary scholar and Equiano biographer Vincent Coretta, it was there that Equiano had heard Whitefield preach. So Equiano actually got his time mixed up while he was writing this his narrative. But nevertheless, he did hear Whitefield preach. The fact that Equiano, then an enslaved person, knew of Whitefield speaks volumes about Whitefield's prowess and reputation as an evangelist. He was a pillar of the Great Awakening, but here in this account, he's a footnote. Equiano's narrative had very little to do with Whitefield, but it was centered on his amazing story of enslavement, freedom, and his fight to abolish England's part in the transatlantic slave trade. This book was instrumental in the nascent abolitionist movement and would help toward Britain's suppression of the slave trade in 1807. History, as we may realize, is contested. History can be viewed from different angles and seen through different lenses. For people interested in the Great Awakening, men such as Whitefield, Edwards, Wesley are luminaries. Those they influenced find a place under the auspices of these quote-unquote great men. What if one is interested in some persons who were influential and interesting in their own right during the same context? Persons who had arrived in the Atlantic world via slave ships. As enslaved Africans, these people were introduced to 18th century evangelical Christianity. For Phyllis Wheatley and Lyle de Equiano, Whitefield occupied a part of their story, not the center. So by shifting the center from Whitefield and focusing on African-born persons and persons of African descent who were writers, thinkers, and activists, we're able to understand Whitefield in a larger world that held Africans in bondage within the contradictions of the gospel he preached. As Whitefield advocated for slavery in the colony of Georgia during the 18th century, Africans themselves who became Christians argued for abolition and sought a beloved community. So my approach is that of an Africanist scholar. And I'm interested in the story of Africans both on the continent and abroad, both free and enslaved in the 18th century Atlantic world. The Great Awakening presaged what historians Evelyn Higginbotham and the late John Hope Franklin have described as a period of self-determination and self-help as Africans and their descendants began to establish their own institutions, including churches. So in this talk, I'm highlighting the lives, writing, and work of two African-born Christians, Lyle de Equiano and Phyllis Wheatley, and one American-born Christian of African descent, George Lyle. All three are important in this context of evangelical revivals, in which Whitefield was so important. But they have stories and influence that are prominent on their own. Phyllis, Equiano, and George Lyle represent contestants or opponents of European and Euro-American Christian power that established and sustained the enslavement of Africans and their descendants in the Atlantic world. All three were what we shall call Calvinists, each striving to argue and assert their African humanity within a world of slavery and oppression. So, a brief history of the quote unquote slaves' Great Awakening. Historians of the African American Church assert that the Great Awakening is the beginnings of African Christianity. This period also spilled into the Revolutionary era, which for enslaved Africans and African descendants was the first age of emancipation. Those who became Christians also asserted for their freedom from slavery. This was an unforeseen consequence of these revivals. We know that major revivalists like Edwards and Whitefield upheld slavery and owned enslaved persons themselves. This showed that enslaved Africans saw Christianity as a liberating force. Albert J. Rabbitoe calls this period the dawn of a new day in his classic book, Slave Religion. During the 17th century, European planters in North America were uninterested in evangelizing their African bondspersons. There were efforts by the Society of the Propagation of the Gospel, SPG, the foreign missionary arm of the Church of England, to catechize enslaved Africans in British North America. These efforts failed to produce many converts among the enslaved. Rabbitoe and historian James Campbell contend that the Great Awakening of the 1740s fostered the growth of African American Christianity, especially in the Southern colonies. Michael Gomez, historian, in his book Exchanging Our Country Marks, contends that anti-slavery preaching attracted African and African descendant enslaved persons to Christianity. Historian Sylvia Fry and Betty Wood, in their Come Shouting to Zion, write that enslaved Africans and the African descendant were active in their own religious transformation as the awakening transformed Euro-American Protestantism. Gomez again adds to this conversation by stating that Africans responded within their own cultural habits rather than conforming to the dominant culture of that day. Africans and their descendants were at home culturally. Africans and African descendant persons joined Baptist and Methodist churches primarily. The major reason articulated by historians is that these revivalistic preachers, Baptists and Methodists, preached that Africans were the spiritual equals of Europeans. Jonathan Edwards, who was not Baptist or Methodist, yet Jonathan Edwards reported that, quote, many of the poor Negroes, unquote, in New England had experienced a great change, quote, wrought upon them, unquote, by the gospel and the Holy Spirit. Chief revival preachers like Whitefield and Gilbert Tennant noted the presence of Africans within the crowds that came to hear their preaching. Whitefield reported that on one occasion in Philadelphia, near 50 Negroes came to give me thanks for what God had done to their souls. That was in 1740. Tennant, in a letter to Whitefield, stated that the preaching in Charlestown, Massachusetts, greatly affected the Africans present there. According to historians Deborah Gray White, Waldo Martin, and Mia Bay, African Christians used Christianity to contend against slavery, even using what they heard from revivalists and reinterpreting their messages in an anti-slavery fashion. For example, Africans and African descendant persons in New England filed freedom suits that argued for their freedom based on their natural rights. The most celebrated freedom case of this period was the Somerset case, rendered in 1772 in England. This case dealt with an American-born enslaved man, James Somerset, who was taken to England by his master, Charles Stewart. While there, Somerset ran away, but he was caught and placed on a ship bound for Jamaica. Anti-slavery activist Granville Sharp heard of this and secured a writ of habeas corpus for Somerset. In the case, the Chief Justice decided that Somerset could refuse transportation off of English soil, since England never had a quote unquote positive law that established slavery. So this case didn't end slavery in England, because you had planters from the West Indies, for example, who would have their slaves with them on the island, but it did give enslaved Africans there the right to remain there and not be sent to the West Indies. The very next year, 1773, enslaved persons in Massachusetts petitioned the legislature for their freedom in a petition signed by a Felix. And they presented their arguments by using both natural law or natural rights, but also the Holy Scriptures. And the next year, a formerly enslaved person named Caesar Sauter wrote an essay against slavery from a Christian perspective. So that's the broad context. So now I want to speak about George Lyle and the founding of African churches, but more about George Lyle and his work. So what I conclude at this point, based on these arguments in historiography, is that Africans and the African descendant were integral in the overall awakening. Because again, if we broaden the picture of what the Great Awakening was, we have all of this activity by enslaved Africans, free Africans, so forth and so on, who are Christians. The story is just not about the work of Edwards and Tennant and Whitefield. The African descendant Africans, they were targets of evangelism, especially in the southern colonies. As a result, we see the founding of the earliest independent African churches in Virginia and Georgia at the end of the Revolutionary period here in America in the 1770s. The independent churches predate the founding of African Methodist Episcopal churches by nearly 40 years. Again, I'm referring to Baptist churches here. Though the movement within Methodism to found independent African churches starts in the 1780s. Now, the historians agree that one man had his hand in pushing the African American Baptist movement forward, and that man was George Lyle. Lyle was born around 1750 in Virginia, but moved with his master Henry Sharp to Burke County, South Carolina, just a few years before the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, possibly in 1772. Sharp taught some of his enslaved persons to read and write, which was illegal at the time. One enslaved person he taught was Lyle. Sharp was actually a deacon in the Baptist church in Burke County, which Reverend Matthew Moore led. As Lyle attended worship service with his master, the preaching of Moore struck him, and he experienced conversion. And he was converted sometime in 1773. Moore was a revivalist preacher in the same vein as a Whitefield and a Wesley. So after Lyle's conversion and his testimony, Lyle received membership in the church through believers' baptism in 1774. Soon after becoming a Christian, Lyle showed that he had a gift for preaching the gospel. So the church gave Lyle allowance to preach on the plantations along the Savannah River. If you're familiar with the geography of that part of the country, the Savannah River separates Georgia from South Carolina. So there was a lot of movement in both places. So he would go to Georgia and also plantations in South Carolina, where he preached to the members of his own church, and also he preached to enslaved people on different plantations. So Sharp demonstrated his own degree of Christian enlightenment by emancipating Lyle in order for Lyle to preach full time. A few weeks following giving Lyle his freedom, Deacon Sharp died, and Sharp's children planned to re-enslave Lyle and actually imprison him owing to his British sympathies or owing to their love of money. I'd say probably both, because George Lyle was what we call a black loyalist, and Sharp's children were patriots. Upon learning of the plan to imprison him, Lyle hastened to borrow $700 from a British colonel named Kirkland in order to flee the colonies with his family, realizing that he would have a better chance at living a free life outside of North American prejudice and the possibility of re-enslavement. He decided to resettle in the English colony of Jamaica. Now, it's interesting that he would choose Jamaica. Jamaica was a slave colony. We don't have answers about why he chose Jamaica, but at this particular time, there weren't too many places for a man of African descent, a formerly enslaved person, to go to outside of the bounds of slavery. Nevertheless, the ship on which Lyle and his family would travel across the Caribbean was in harbor for a few weeks. And during this time, Lyle went to Savannah and baptized some African American converts he had preached to during his days as a plantation preacher in Georgia. Lyle baptized these converts in the Savannah River, among who were Andrew Bryan and others who would become the founding members of First African Baptist Church in Savannah. When Lyle left America, he went to Jamaica as the indentured servant of Colonel Kirkland. So when Lyle arrived on the island, he witnessed the sad spiritual condition of enslaved Africans and their descendants there, and he was there in Kingston, and that moved him. So as a result, Lyle began to preach the gospel at the racetracks. Later, he rented a room and organized a Baptist church of 4 people. But after that, the church grew enormously. In less than 8 years, Lyle had baptized 500 people. In 1789, he built the chapel amid persecution. During this time, he spent time in prison. He actually went to prison this time, and he went on trial for preaching "quote unquote" sedition. Now, we don't know exactly why he was put in prison for preaching sedition. My guess is that he was a Baptist. Besides, he was a man of African descent. I mean, that says something right there. But he was a Baptist, so considered a nonconformist in a colony in which the Church of England was the colonial church. But we're not absolutely sure. But from 1805 to 1814, there was a law forbidding preaching to the enslaved population, and that was carried out. So actually, as Lyle continued his ministry on the island, he was doing so against the colonial law, although he was carrying out what he believed to be the commandment of God. Finally, in 1814, English Baptists sent missionaries to Jamaica at the behest of Lyle. He was asking them for support, and they finally gave that support and recognized his work. So Lyle was a founder of independent African churches, church in South Carolina, where he was on the plantation as an enslaved person. He helped to found First African in Savannah, and that church grew into 3 other churches. So he was a founder of independent African churches, both in the North American colonies, so South Carolina and Georgia, but also in Jamaica. And he was a product of the Great Awakening. There's no arguments against that. But he was opposed to slavery. And he was a man who worked to help enslaved Africans in Jamaica flourish on the eve of abolition there. So that's Lyle. And the short story of the founding of independent African American churches. Next, Whitfield. I'm sorry, I'm not Whitfield. Wheatley. Sorry, Wheatley, and her writings to George Whitefield. So Phyllis Wheatley, born around 1753, a little girl in the region of Senegambia, was captured, enslaved, survived the torturous journey on a slave ship, and sold to a British American named John Wheatley living in Boston. Wheatley and his wife, Susanna, named this little girl Phyllis, which was the name of the ship that carried her body to North America in 1761. She was a refuse slave, because she was so young and no one really wanted her. So she was called a refuge slave, but the Wheatleys purchased her. And getting to North America in 1761, this was the height of the Great Awakening. So we have this little enslaved girl arriving in this Christian colony during a time of revival. The Wheatleys were members of a congregational church. In addition, Mary Wheatley, daughter to John and Susanna, taught Phyllis the Christian faith as well as Latin, Greek, and English literature. According to the aforementioned Vincent Coretta, who wrote a biography of Phyllis as well, he writes, Susanna Wheatley dealt with Phyllis's religious education as consciously as she did that of her own children. To that end, Phyllis received Christian baptism in 1771 at Old South Church, Boston. You might be wondering, well, why was she baptized so late? Well, at that time, in congregationalist circles in Boston, if you were a member of the church, at least a member of a covenant family, as Phyllis would have been, they delayed baptism until 18. So she was about 18 years old when she received baptism at Old South Church in Boston. So Mary Wheatley and the rest of the household became aware of Phyllis's intelligence and talent. Phyllis Wheatley had a talent for writing poetry, and she was the first Afro-British woman to have her writing published, beginning in 1767, which was, again, at the time where the Great Awakening was still happening, kind of on the wane in New England, but nevertheless, still occurring at the time. And her early poems dealt with Christian issues. Now, a collection of her poems was published as a book in 1773 in London. Now, let me back up a little, and I maybe defending why I label Phyllis Afro-British instead of African American. The simple reason for me is that she's a person of African descent, but she lived as an enslaved woman. She would later get her freedom in an English colony. And she also had ties, and she would also travel to London. So she was part of a British Atlantic world. So I label her as Afro-British, as I also do with a lot of the Equiano. Now, as an Afro-British evangelical woman, Phyllis used her talent to draw attention to the injustice of race-based slavery and attention to African equality in the sight of a merciful God. Now, there would be people who may argue against this, saying that her poetry, her writings aren't directly related to these issues, but I would argue that she does this in a subtle way. So among Phyllis's work, she wrote poems about, she wrote a poem about George Whitefield. She wrote an elegy to the English evangelist who perished in 1770. It's apparent how much Phyllis admired Whitefield as a Christian evangelist that she even wrote this elegy. She had been familiar with his writings and could have seen him in Boston in 1764, according to Coretta. There's no definitive record of Phyllis ever heard him, but it's conceivable her mistress would have brought her along to hear such a renowned evangelist preach. So again, we don't know for sure, but it's conceivable that Phyllis would have heard Whitefield preach in person. So this may explain why Phyllis wrote an elegy in honor of Whitefield in the year that he died. Her poem or elegy is quite moving. When reading it, one senses that she did hear him preach in person. If she didn't, then the poem reveals a marvelous imagination as if she had heard him preach herself. As an elegy, the poem is glowing in its praise of Whitefield. She began, "Hail, happy saint, on thine immortal throne, possessed of glory, life, and bliss unknown." She wrote of his oratorical skills. "We hear no more the music of thy tongue." Later in the poem, she mentioned Whitefield's penchant for addressing Africans in his sermons. She took on the voice of the evangelist. "Take him, ye Africans. He longs for you. Impartial Savior is his title due. Washed in the fountain of redeeming blood, you shall be sons and kings and priests to God." This line raises questions. Was this something that Whitefield included in his preaching to Africans in his audience? And we already know that Africans had been present to hear him. But would he be that forceful? Would he be that clear? Or was this Phyllis taking poetic license and inserting her belief in full African equality? We can't know for sure, but this is a curious line in the elegy. Though Whitefield preached to Africans, he believed that Christianity would make them better slaves, according to Coretta, who reproduces a letter that Whitefield wrote to that effect. Actually, you wrote that letter to the Countess of Huntingdon in England, who he was connected to. So again, Whitefield believed that Christianity would make enslaved Africans better slaves. So would he actually say what Phyllis has him saying in this poem? Historian Frank Lambert, in his book Inventing the Great Awakening, argues that enslaved persons gave their own meaning to the new birth and saw it as opportunity to revolt from their bondage. Now, I don't believe Phyllis's line here could be veiled revolutionary language. I don't get that sense from that text. But it is language of true Christian equality for Africans. It is language that argues against African enslavement, definitely by implication. Though the Wheatleys manumitted Phyllis in 1773, and she may have met would-be abolitionists in London, Phyllis never left any letters that spoke of abolition as her being part of the movement, because the movement doesn't begin until the 1780s. She leaves London before that time. But abolitionists in the 1780s referred to Phyllis's poems as demonstrating African humanity and African equality. We have to be careful with this, which is something that Coretta is not. Those in the 1780s argued such from their European lenses. For these abolitionists, Phyllis showed her humanity and also her intelligence by mastering European art forms and European modes of intelligence. This is an assimilationist perspective. So she exhibits her humanity not in a way that she is as an African woman, but it's because she's entered into European cultural forms and has learned European ways that she's seen as equal, and her humanity is the same as any other Europeans. So that brings me to Equiano. Equiano as Calvinistic, Methodist, Evangelist, and Abolitionist. As mentioned, Equiano heard Whitefield preach in Savannah in 1765. There's no other mention of Whitefield in Equiano's narrative. Also, as mentioned, Equiano's narrative is spiritual autobiography and abolitionist treatise. So it stands to reason why Equiano would not spend more time writing about Whitefield. According to Equiano, he was born in what is now Nigeria in an Igbo village. And let me say parenthetically, there's been a decade and a half controversy regarding his birthplace. I, for one, argue that I trust the narrative, I trust his account. I believe he was born in what is now Nigeria. So he and his sister were captured. He reckons his age as 11 at the time of capture. Other evidence from the text would age him at 7 or 8 years old. So he was very young when he was captured and enslaved. Eventually, he would become a maritime slave and is taken to England. During a time of tutelage by 2 English women, Equiano received holy baptism at St. Margaret's Church in London in 1758. Unlike Phyllis, Equiano purchased his freedom in 1763. Phyllis was emancipated by the Wheatleys. His description of his life as a free African in the Atlantic world is full of adventure, with bouts of racist violence toward his body. Though Equiano was a baptized member of the Church of England, he was not converted until 1774. In chapter 10 of the narrative, Equiano detailed the immediate context of his conversion. While back in London, Equiano became despondent over the death of a friend, John Annis, a formerly enslaved man who was a ship's cook, whom he attempted to rescue from re-enslavement. Again, remember the Somerset decision. That was back in 1772. This is 1774. So Annis had a right to remain on English soil, but his former master tried to re-enslave him. So that former master kidnapped him, placed him on a ship bound for the West Indies. Equiano was unable to get rid of habeas corpus for Annis. So Annis sailed to the West Indies and eventually met his death in the West Indies. Equiano grew despondent and he despaired of life. This led him to seek solace in religion. Eventually, he met with Methodists who shared the gospel with him in a way he had never heard in the established church. Equiano wrote of his conversion that occurred on board a ship in the Mediterranean. This is what he writes. I was reading and meditating on the 4th chapter of the Acts, 12th verse, under the solemn apprehensions of eternity, and reflecting on my past actions. I began to think I had lived a moral life, and that I had a proper ground to believe I had an interest in the divine favor. But still meditating on the subject, not knowing whether salvation was to be had partly for our own good deeds or solely as the sovereign gift of God. In this deep consternation, the Lord was pleased to break in upon my soul with its bright beams of heavenly light, and in an instant, as it were, removing the veil and letting light into a dark place, I saw clearly with the eye of faith the crucified Savior bleeding on the cross on Mount Calvary. The scriptures became an unsealed book. I saw myself a condemned criminal under the law, which came with its full force to my conscience. And when commandment came, sin revived, and I died. I saw the Lord Jesus Christ in his humiliation, loaded and bearing my reproach, sin and shame. Then he writes a little bit later, now the Ethiopian was willing to be saved by Jesus Christ. the sinner's only surety, and also to rely on none other person or thing for salvation. I love that last line. Now the Ethiopian, that was a general name for Africans, the people of African descent at that time in the Atlantic world. He's saying that basically God has deemed it so to include people of African descent and Africans in his redemptive plan. So after his conversion, Equiano would dedicate the rest of his life to evangelism and abolitionism. While working in the Caribbean, along the Mosquito Coast in present-day Nicaragua, he shared the gospel with a local leader there. Once back in London, he actually desired to become a missionary of the Anglican Church with hopes to go to West Africa. But the Bishop of London rejected his application, and Equiano is guarded regarding the reason why. But read between the lines of that text, there's some racism involved in the Bishop of London's rejection of Equiano's application to become a missionary. Nevertheless, Equiano was part of the abolitionist movement in London, and it was because of his presence that English members of the abolitionist movement in the 1780s, all of them evangelicals, urged him to write his story as mentioned, so that he can put forward his experiences as a person enslaved, the person who gained his freedom, the person who knew what it meant to be an African in the Atlantic world, and the racism and the segregation and the prejudice, that his story would lend itself to abolitionism. So as I conclude, what we see here is that this was an important period in the history of the Black Atlantic, as enslaved Africans became Christians and saw their new faith as a means for their freedom. This period establishes the foundation for the ongoing freedom struggle of Africans and African descendant persons in the Atlantic world into the 19th century. As Phyllis may have seen Whitefield and Equiano did, they both view their evangelical Christianity as spiritual freedom that should also result in physical freedom from the bondage of slavery. Though Lyle never heard Whitefield, he came to faith through a Whitefield-styled evangelist. Lyle was a builder, a church founder, yet he was determined to preserve his freedom from slavery as a Black loyalist. What this brief history shows is how African or African American Christians contextualize Christianity to serve the good of their souls and bodies. This is something that Whitefield was blind to. In an age of revivals, Africans and African descendant persons carved a niche to make this an age of freedom as well. Thank you.
Pastor Sara, we can't hear you.
I want to thank you, Dr.
All right.
Washington, for giving to us a perspective that is a helpful corrective to enlarge our understanding of the Great Awakening and its effect on the soul identity that leads to a physical public expression of freedom, and giving it through three people and how they responded. This is a time when all who are present are encouraged to ask your question, make a comment, and Dr. Washington will respond to you. As you're collecting your thoughts, I would like to just give a little perspective.
Mm-hmm.
You shared that Whitefield said that Christianity would make better slaves.
Yeah.
First thing I thought was, that is is so racist, that is so using of people. Second thought was the Apostle Paul writing to the churches. And in each of the oikonomia, it's a house, the house management. Having Christ would make a better husband, make a better wife, make a better honoring child, make a better household slave, make a better citizen. So I was wondering if you could just comment on Whitefield, perhaps, and Paul, and what you see as a common or distinction in those two.
Yeah, that's a good question. You anointed me as a theologian, so I'm definitely I'm a theologically minded historian, but yeah, that's a great question. I think that's something that we have to grapple with. I mean, people can argue that the scriptures, Old and New Testament, do not explicitly speak against slavery. And that's an argument, but we have to contextualize this. Paul's writing in the context. Yes, slavery existed in the Roman Empire. It wasn't chattel slavery. Definitely wasn't chattel slavery. Whitefield is saying that in a time in which there is chattel enslavement, I mean, real brutal enslavement, definitely in North America, British North America at the time, because I mean, he's advocating for slavery in Georgia in the 18th century. When Georgia was founded, Georgia said, we're not going to have any slaves. But he's advocating for the 18th century. So you have 200 years. You have 100 years of enslavement already, and it's established in British North America, let alone what's going on in the British West Indies.
Mm-hmm.
And there had already been, and again, I don't know exactly when he wrote that letter, but I'm thinking that it's probably post Stono. There's a Stono rebellion in South Carolina in 1739, in which you have these African-born enslaved people who rise up.
That's right.
And they were actually headed to Florida via Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
So I think Whitefield's statement has to go in that context of this growing sense of enslaved African revolution. And he's looking at Christianity as being a stopgap measure for that, to make slave docile. So he's actually he's actually looking forward to and anticipating the arguments of the 19th century in the South, in which Presbyterians like Charles Colcock Jones, who's the father of plantation missions in the South, he makes the same argument that Christianity is going to make enslaved people docile and make them good servants. So I think the ends don't mesh when you compare Paul's writing to the churches and Whitfield's letter to the Countess of Huntington, and then others who follow in Whitfield's line of thinking into the 19th century.
Okay, thank you for that.
Yeah.
We have a question of how may one get a bibliography about the original accounts and scholars mentioned?
Yeah, actually, I definitely I can provide that. Actually, what my text I was reading from, I actually do have a short bibliography, so I can make that available if someone on the technical side there. I mean, but for the time being, I can just spout off a few works. I mentioned Vincent Coretta quite a bit. He wrote a biography of Phyllis Wheatley, as well as edited a collection of her poems. So that's Vincent Coretta. Vincent Corretta also wrote a biography of Olaode Equiano. I mentioned Albert J. Raboteau. That's Raboteau, Raboteau. Albert J. Raboteau and the Slave Religion. That's a classic work. I would also throw in Paul Harvey, Through the Night. A history. I think it's called Through the Storm, Through the Night. A history of African American Christianity. I did mention Frank Lambert. I mentioned his work, Inventing the Great Awakening. Those were works that I know I mentioned. Yes, so that's a brief bibliography.
Thank you very much for that.
Mhm.
And another question is, considering the financial implications for the slave trade, how should we think about other important white Americans like Washington and other national leaders who owned slaves while inventing freedom for America that
Wow.
has affected the whole world?
Great question. Yeah. I think for that you have to consider that these folk did not believe that enslaved Africans, and really Africans in general, were or could be part of a political community. I think that's the main thing, because it's just not about enslavement.
Mm-hmm.
Because very early, right after the early republic, right after the federal period in American history. So when Washington is dead and gone, and you have Jefferson, who is president, he's third president after Adams, and excuse me, in 1800 you have a revolt in Richmond, Virginia, Gabriel's Revolt. So that makes people nervous about, number one, sustainability of the institution of slavery. So there's a crackdown on movement and so forth. But then, in the years coming after that, we get into the 18 teens, Jefferson and others and people from the church, Robert Finley, who's a Presbyterian, they found the American Colonization Society. And what they believe is that, like Finley, he's against slavery, but he's also against free Africans being part of the American Republic. So I think that's where we make the distinction.
I see. Yeah.
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 So you can hold slaves, and all you holding those slaves, they're slaves. They're non-persons in terms of the Republic. But once people are manumitted and are purchasing their freedom, then the question comes: can we really live together in harmony? And the answer for many people, especially that second generation, right after the so-called founding fathers, that no. So the idea would be, let's colonize these folks. Let's send them off. Let's send them off to Liberia, because that was the colony that would have been founded. Mm-hmm. So I think that's one approach. That's an approach that I would take to try to unravel that particular question.
So there's really a sequestering rather than an integration of a view of common humanity. I would like to just ask about why it was that the law forbidding preaching to slaves in 1805. Can you talk about what was the danger of preaching?
Oh yeah, that was in Jamaica. So Jamaica had more of a concern for slave revolts than that really the United States had at the time. I mean, there's a long history of small scale revolts in Jamaica throughout the 18th century. So yeah, Jamaicans, white planters on that island definitely saw Christianity as being a tool that could be used for liberation. So let's not preach to slaves. Although by this time in Jamaica's history, you are seeing a free African population emerging, and that's that law, yeah, don't preach to slaves, but it also had to do with controlling free Africans as well on that island, because you know, free Africans, they're not slaves, but they have connections to enslaved people. So it was a law really that was against all people of African descent. And George Lyle was a free person, and that affected him. Um, so yeah, I mean the Jamaican Colonial Assembly was afraid of further insurrections.
Preaching can cause revolts. When Martin Luther was preaching in the Protestant protesting movement that led to the Reformation, peasant revolt broke out.
Mhm.
And Luther said, I didn't mean that is
Right.
the outcome. So what does, in your estimation, as a bridge to where we are now, what would preaching look like to set the soul of our common humanity free? It's a big question, but preaching can be dangerous if it's a manipulated word versus
Right.
word of God that brings a spiritual liberation that has an outward expression. But what would preaching look like today to not lead to revolt or burning and riots, but would lead to what freedom would look like? Can you just talk about that?
Yeah, definitely. I think preaching has to be honest, calling things as they are. So it definitely has to be prophetic, calling sin out, calling for repentance, deep-seated repentance, definitely, because you have people who are hurting because of society, because of history, and I think true prophetic preaching or prophetic preaching has a healing quality to it.
Okay.
It has a healing quality. So you are preaching good news to the bruised, to the wounded, as well as preaching against those who have wounded, those who have oppressed, and to give that group a better way. You know, in our tradition, the better way is love for God, love for humanity, and have to do right by humanity. So it's like Zacchaeus when he's confronted. Actually, he's confronted, but he actually confesses. He confesses his dirty deeds. What does he do? He says, "I am going to repair this. I am going to return twofold of the money that I've extracted, that I've stolen from these innocent people." So that was impressed upon him by the very person of Jesus Christ. So yeah, we have to preach reparation in that sense, repair the breach, and to the wounded, we have to preach healing, and that the word of God heals. Not that we say that you just take it, you take injustice, because even the Apostle Paul didn't take injustice when he was flogged as a Roman citizen without getting a hearing. He called that out.
Right.
He called it out. But I think the onus is on the person who has, or the people who have wounded, and that group of people, we have to preach that they have to repair that woundedness and so forth. So power of the Holy Spirit would cause that to happen. Definitely.
Right. It's so true. Well, that leads me to another question. You began your lecture with Equiano, calling him an evangelical man. You called Phyllis Wheatley evangelical woman.
Mm-hmm.
What is an evangelical? If you would be so kind as to help us clarify, given that we're in context where that is a big question, as well as sometimes used as a pejorative or a superlative.
Yes. I'm calling them evangelicals in that 18th century context, which would be people who believed the gospel, believed in Jesus Christ, and believed in a new birth experience. Phyllis doesn't give us a testimony. Equiano does. Lyle had to in a New Light Baptist church, which was a church that believed in the necessity of the new birth. And we know that Whitefield and Wesley, Tennant, Edwards, they preached the necessity of new birth, and people had to give a credible confession of faith regarding that experience. So, and also with that, they believed in the virgin birth and literal resurrection of Christ and so forth and so on. But that necessity of the new birth in that context made one an evangelical, because even though like Equiano had been, he had been in church since he was a teenager. He really never heard the gospel preached in those Anglican churches. He thought that, well, he was a legalist basically. He thought he can live by 8 out of the 10 commandments and somehow make it into heaven. He thought that justified him. So that's the way I'm using the term. Yeah, I definitely know that nowadays that term has changed into something far different than what it was in the 18th century. And I'm definitely not using that term in that way. I would not say that Laude Equiano is will be a modern day evangelical. Yeah, he might be something different. He would remain who he was, but I don't think he would. He probably wouldn't say, "I'm not an evangelical." No, not in this context.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that clarification. Mm-hmm. Speaking of evangelical in the 18th century, believing in Jesus Christ, primarily that new birth experience, not church membership and orthodoxy. Just it was a new birth, a new way. We have a question that's been submitted. How does John Merritt fit into the story?
Oh, thank you for that question. I thought about including him. It's been a while since I've dealt with John Merritt, but from what I can remember from John Merritt's the narrative, he actually was converted hearing George Whitefield preach, I think in South Carolina, and Merritt became part of the Huntington connection. So yeah, he fits prominently within this context. Yeah, definitely could have chosen him to highlight. I chose Lyle because of his prominence in terms of founding churches, which Merritt did not do. But yeah, he's integral to this, very much. He is Boston King, Granola Show. There for you, Jupiter Hammond. Yeah, I could include all of them.
Very good. Mm-hmm. So another question has come. In looking at the lives of Lyle, Wheatley, and Equiano, how were they treated by their society? And
Great question.
what's the big takeaway for us today?
Yeah,
An
great
application.
question. Great question.
Mhm.
Well, Phyllis is interesting because again, she's this refugee slave and was basically a domestic servant, enslaved, but domestic. But in that context of Puritan covenantal theology, she's included in the family. Again, she's taught Greek and Latin, so she's given a classical education, and she's part of the household. She's baptized at 18. She travels to London with the Wheatleys and so forth, becomes published. But here's the thing, and I think it's dangerous for us to stop there. And I'm appreciative of this question. I mean, she does get married to a free African man. I think his name is Peters. But she dies at the age of 31, I believe, and she dies poor. When she goes back to Massachusetts after her book is published in London, she's a free woman. She's manumitted. She's emancipated. But what did it really mean?
Mhm.
She had no livelihood, and for a writer at that time, you needed subscribers. They would put up money beforehand. So it's like nowadays getting an advance
Mhm.
on a book that you haven't written yet. All those subscriptions dried up. Don't know why, but they dried up. So she died poor.
Mhm.
I mean, definitely were they white folks who died poor, and they definitely. But she had been an enslaved person. She had nothing in the beginning,
Mhm.
and she had nothing at the end.
Mhm.
So I would look at that as being a sore on society. That a woman who was celebrated as precocious and called genius and bondage or something, self-made genius and something like that, that she would die penniless is an affront to that society.
Mhm.
Yeah, Equiano. Oh my goodness. Um, I mean, definitely was enslaved for uh, until he was in his early 20s, I think. Um, but and he was mistreated definitely. Although he was a maritime slave, he still had bouts of mistreatment. But I think his most difficult days actually came after he was emancipated.
In what way?
Well, he one example that he gives in the narrative is when he was in Savannah, Georgia, and he visited a friend of his who was enslaved, and the man's master noticed Equiano, the strange Negro, and basically forbade Equiano for being in the yard, and accosted him with some other people. That was and he was thrown into prison because of that. Another occasion, he was strung up by his ankles. Again, he's a free person, and he was accosted in that way, mistreated, and he stayed away from the British North American colonies because of that. He despised Georgia after that. Um, so yeah, he was mistreated as a free African man. I really think that is that is an important part of his narrative. Um, and even while in England, even in his role as an abolitionist, um, I think people just distrusted him, especially some work that he tried to do. He tried to go to Sierra Leone in 1787 with the so-called poor blacks to London who were being shipped off, from London because they were seen as a public charge. So ship him back to Africa. And Ecuano wanted to go. He wanted to go back to Africa, and he got a job as a commissary. But people were blaming him for being incompetent, whether he was or not. I think we can't disassociate that people just distrusted him because he was an African man. Um, And Lyle repeated, just to reiterate what I said before. Um, his former master's children tried to re-enslave him. He had to flee. He goes to Jamaica, and there he's put in jail because he's preaching outside, and he's a Baptist, and plus he's a man of African descent, and he's preaching to enslaved people. So yeah, he had a tough time in his ministry. So I think all of these people, they are examples of just what life was like in the Atlantic world for Africans and people of African descent.
As we come to our last 3 or 4 minutes, is there a way for us now, 2020, to have a bridge that takes us not into repeating, but into the new creation, the new, and the Holy Scriptures that give spiritual emancipation, spiritual freedom, and give a dignity to every human being? Is there a bridge that you can recommend or see or prophesy?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in my best moments of thinking, I believe that there is a bridge. In my normal everyday life, thinking about this, the bridge doesn't go across the river. But I think that there is some hope. And yeah, I think there's hope, and I'll come to something that I actually wrote over the summertime when I wrote a piece reflecting on George Floyd and thinking what should evangelicals be thinking about. And I concluded that piece by saying that I think it's time for white evangelicals to take a back seat. I think it's time now for white evangelicals to say, we've had our time, and we have to take a back seat to evangelicals of color. Let evangelicals of color take the lead on these issues, on all issues, really, in terms of the church, because white evangelicals have gotten to where we are right now. Slavery, segregation, disenfranchisement, all that stuff. Yeah.
Sara, we lost your sound again.
Just want to thank you again.
No, okay, thank you.
We've got a few that just want to connect with you. We'll make sure that happens. And in 1 minute, we have the last question. Would you share thoughts on what we whites need to do for repairing the breach, the woundedness, both for us convicted and for us in society?
Yeah. I think definitely supporting righteous causes in our society, and listening, but definitely supporting righteous causes. Even though this country, I think, is far away from having a national policy of reparations for slavery, I think now local communities, individuals can actually begin preparing with a lot of different things. Too many to name right now in this short period of time, but definitely work toward what Dr. King called the beloved community.
That's a beautiful closing. God bless you. Let's all be in touch, and we will make sure that the few comments that were directed specifically to you with follow-up questions will get to you.
Definitely. Thank you
all for joining, and encourage you to be with us tomorrow for the commemoration service of Whitefield. Dr. Mark Knoll and Dr. Tom Schwanda and Dr. Sean McIver will be sharing. And then the following evening on Thursday, Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative, author of Just Mercy, will be sharing. And followed by Gregory Downs of Oxford University, the Wesley Center, will be giving an evangelical, how to finish well as an evangelical. Very important. So thank you. Hope to see you again.